All right, thank you, Neil. A very good afternoon to all present here. I, Surbi, faculty member of Biology, on the behalf of the organizing committee of the 2-week online faculty development program on enhancing psychological skills for teaching and practice, organized by the Department of Applied Psychology in association with the Teaching Learning Center, Ramanujan College, University of Delhi, take this opportunity to extend a very warm welcome to all the esteemed dignitaries and participants who have joined us today on Zoom platform for a third live session. I present to you the topic of this afternoon's live session, choosing appropriate qualitative research design. We are honored to have with us our esteemed speakers, Dr. Apurv Chauhan and Dr. Surbi Sehgal, who will be guiding us through this discourse. Thank you for gracing the session with your honorable presence. Dr. Apurv is an alumnus of Zakir Hussain Delhi College. Subsequently, he was a Commonwealth Trust and Cambridge Trust funded scholar at University of Cambridge, where he received his MPhil in social psychology. He was a LSE scholar at the London School of Economics, completed his PhD under the supervision of Professor Catherine Campbell. He was also the recipient of a postdoctoral award from Canadian Institute of Health Research for a fellowship at Discourse Science Public Lab at University of Gulf, Canada. Dr. Apurv is a principal lecturer in social psychology at the University of Brighton, UK. He is a sitting member of British Psychological Society Senatorial National Expert Reference Group on Poverty. His research examines socio-cultural construction of risk, trust, and their management, public understanding of science and science communication related to vaccines and 5G technology. A second strand of his research explores healthcare decision making amongst poor people in India. Dr. Surbi Sehgal is an alumnus of Department of Psychology, University of Delhi, where she completed her PhD under the supervision of Professor Anand Prakash. Dr. Surbi is a senior lecturer in human resource management, organizational behavior at the Brighton Business School, University of Brighton, UK. Her research focuses on emotion during organizational change, and at present, she is involved in a joint research project that looks at collective emotions in response to COVID-19 across different countries. She's an active member of the Center of Resilience for Social Justice at the university, where she undertakes research in the areas of building resilient communities using positive psychology interventions. She is also a lifetime member of the British Psychological Society. I welcome Dr. Apurv and Dr. Surbi to enlighten us by their understanding on the topic. We welcome you, sir and ma'am.
Thank you very much. I just realized that the paragraph that I sent was probably a little too long. So thank you very much, Surbi, for being patient with somewhat long paragraph. It's a note to self that I should.
I would like to welcome Apurv and Surbi from my side, because I will take a little more time of you. It's not complete as yet. So please be with us for one more. I know it's not comfortable for you, Apurv, but that is, I would like to express myself. So very warm welcome to Dr. Apurv and Dr. Surbi. Thank you so much for making here today. Despite an extremely hectic schedule, it is a pleasure to welcome you both. Surbi is a dear friend. We have done our MA together, our PhD together, and under Anand sir, and then also cleared our NET exam together after numerous attempts.
I still haven't got a net.
He still hasn't cleared net. So.
I took net 10 times, I think, not less than 10 times.
So he was qualified enough to teach in the UK, but not qualified enough to
not
teach in India. So.
I can get it. Let me go ahead. Surbi was like a co-guide to me during my PhD time, always giving me suggestions, ideas when required, and provided me with a neutral perspective, which is so difficult sometimes to come in your own research. I know Apoor from when he was a university teaching assistant. I think that was the time I came to know about him. And I often found him engaging in intellectual discussions in AP Sir room. So he was there in my PhD Viva and gave very useful, insightful feedback related to the qualitative methodology. I just wished at that time if I could have got this knowledge a little early, as many a times it is too late to make changes in your research. So qualitative research requires a lot of rigor, knowledge, and clarity regarding both about your own self and about the design. So both Surbi and Apoor are very passionate about this subject. And so when this topic was decided, the only names that came to my mind was them. So I'm sure this session would give us a deep insight and clarity of the purpose about doing qualitative research. With these words, I welcome you both again. Over to you.
Oh, thank you, Shalini. Thank you.
It's a lot to live up to now.
You've already set the expectations and you've raised the bar. So I think it becomes more difficult for us. But we wouldn't want this to be. Have you started the?
I'll start screen sharing. Yeah.
Just a minute.
Okay.
Let's just. So yeah, let me start by thanking Shalini and all the members of the organizing team of this faculty development program. It is indeed an honor and also a pleasure to start interacting with my colleagues from all across different places in India. And we can't express how enthusiastic and excited we are to be wanting to bring whatever little we've learned over the last many years of having done qualitative research, both in India and the UK, and bring forth those challenges to all of you so that we can engage in the community of learners where we do not position ourselves as expert on the field. However, we are here to just raise certain questions which in our opinion might inform us, all of us who are very passionate about wanting to engage with qualitative research. So thank you, Shalini. Thank you, all the members of the organizing committee to give us this opportunity. To you, Apoor. Do you want to say something?
No, you said enough, I think.
Right.
I'll start the screen share so that everyone can see the PowerPoint that we would be using. We're very happy to share this to you
once the session is over
as a PowerPoint.
This one.
Share screen. I need to find the PT window, don't I?
I don't know. Just scroll down. Show all windows. I have not. So this is the one. Yeah.
There.
So just let us know if you can see the slide.
Yes, we can.
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Is it on full screen?
Yes, it's visible.
So can someone show that
yeah,
nobody else has the control of the technical staff? If you can just ensure that only the two of us have the control.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Okay, Shalini, I also want to learn a little bit more about the modalities of this discussion. So I already see a couple of participants raising their hands. So do you want us to attend to those participants, or do you want us to just present and, because we just need to be sure whether we should be checking the chat box, etc.
I think the thing goes like this, that you can finish your whatever your PPTs have, and then we can save the questions for the last. Okay, and there is one person who's noting down all the questions. I don't know whether it will be feasible for all the questions to be answered, but we'll take most of them. We'll try to take most of them, and whosoever which are left, we can take in the discussion forum.
Brilliant. That's helpful. So in any case, I would still keep looking at the chat, because at any given point in time, only one of us would be speaking. So I'd keep looking at the chat. So all right. So Let's start.
Hello, good morning, everyone. When Shalini first got in touch with us, this was the title she gave. And we had this title, Choosing Appropriate Qualitative Research Design, until this morning. And this morning when I was having tea and I was looking at the presentation, I realized something that maybe it is time that we ditch the words research design when talking about qualitative stuff and think more in terms of approach. The reason why I say that, I mean, it's not a big, massive point, but the reason why I say it is that research designs are something we have imported from the time when psychology used to be quant, and quant was the only correct form of doing psychology. I mean, that was as recent as, I suppose, until the 80s, there was much less acceptance of qualitative research, and research was thought to be quantitative, and that dates back to the whole Cartesian debate on what is knowledge. So I think let us gently start by saying that we are more interested in what we can call as qualitative approach to research. On that note, what the plan for today is that we'll split it in three parts. The first part is where I would set up what the problematic of the whole session is going to be, what problematic we are going to talk to you about in today's session in terms of doing qualitative research. The second section would be regarding thinking in terms of how can we use appropriate methodologies and methods in qualitative research. I mean, as you all know, qualitative research is an umbrella term. It covers a lot of different methods and techniques. So the issue is in thinking in terms of what methodology we should be using and how we make that methodology appropriate and suitable. And on that front, we'll talk about three things. We'll talk about biases in qualitative methods. So we would do that. So we would also talk about the use of categories, which is a fascinating thing to consider in qualitative research. We all use categories. Rich, poor, male, female, all these are categories that we use in qualitative research. So we would talk about that. And then finally, I'll close that with a discussion on context, which is something else that we see a lot in the discussions and the papers that we read today. Everyone is talking about context, the context of this, the context of that, but what really is context, and why should we be slightly more careful about when we are referring or alluding to context? So that's the plan. Now, let's begin with framing the problematic. Before I get there, I have a quick question, because on my screen, I see the chat when, oh, okay, I can minimize this, I think. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, yeah, that's all sorted. Right. So let me start off by sort of talking in terms of what the framework of any research is, qualitative or quantitative. And this paper, which Jan Valsina has penned, and I think it's a beautiful paper. Jan Valsina sort of frames it in terms of these little boxes that you see in the diagram on the left-hand side, that research is, any process of research, qualitative or quantitative, has these different things going on. So there are basic assumptions, then there's the phenomena that you're investigating, then you have the methods that are used to investigate the phenomena, and then there's the theory, and also the data element, right? Now, these different elements, they work differently depending on whether you take a deductive or an inductive approach to research. So if you take a deductive approach to research, which is more or less theory verifying, so you have a theory, you begin with a theory, the theory entails the basic assumptions that you make, you apply that to the phenomena using the methods, and the data is in a sense theory driven. So you're driven by the theory that you have, and what you end up doing is hypothesis testing, the good old classical psychological research where you build hypothesis and you test the hypothesis. But it works in many different ways. That's not the only way that it works these days. We often, grounded theory is a very good example. You don't begin with any hypothesis. I mean, Glaser and Strauss almost even recommend that you start without a literature review. So the essence then is, and that's the point that Jan Valsina tries to make, and he does make it really beautifully in this paper, is that all of it should be thought in terms of starting with the phenomena and thinking, what is the phenomena that we are going to investigate? Phenomena is a beautiful and in many ways the right spot to start any research inquiry, because at the end of the day, that's where you're headed. So you begin with the phenomena and then check what your basic assumptions, codes are, and the methods are. So in this talk, this is the main argument that we would be driving at, that how do we make our assumptions and methods congruent with the phenomena that we investigate. And because it's a session on qualitative research, we're talking about qualitative research only and not quant. So is that fair? Does everyone is everyone on board with this sort of a framework? Right. So let's begin with that. A little bit of history, not too long. I'll probably spend less than a minute on this. Here's a fascinating thing. Qualitative research, the term itself is very recent. The acceptance of qualitative methods to do research in psychology, they're very recent. But originally, the term qualitative was used a lot in chemistry. And in fact, there is a sort of a sub-branch of chemistry called qualitative chemistry. So on the left-hand side, there's a paper titled On the Qualitative Separation of Nickel from Cobalt by the Action of Ammonium Hydroxide on the Ferricyanides. Now, that's one of the earliest uses of the term qualitative in a scientific paper, and that was in year 1900. On the right-hand side, the orange bit, is the first time the word qualitative appeared in a psychology journal. And it's, as the title gives away, it's a rather sort of amusing study. It was very psychophysics. If you bear through the 54 pages of this paper, you would realize that it's a very psychophysics-based study. So what we see is that the word has been kicking around for a while now. But more recently, we have come to know qualitative methods as we know them right now. And in doing so, what I want to emphasize is that much of what we do in qualitative research alludes to what in philosophy, or in philosophy of mind, I should say, we would refer as qualia. Now, qualia is plural. The singular is quale. There are many complicated ways in which I can talk to you about qualia. A sort of a famous and rather sort of a well-known example of qualia is of Mary the Coral Scientist, which was given by Jackson in '84, and he sort of in that beautiful paper on qualitative on epistemology, he gave this example. I won't detail on this example because it's slightly more complicated. I'll give you a simpler example. So what qualia is not knowledge of objective world. And this is slightly complicated, so bear with me. What qualia is not objective knowledge. So let's give an example. Let's think of an apple, right? Imagine a person who has never tasted an apple, never had an apple. But the person knows what sweet is. The person knows what sour is. The person has tasted sweet, sour, but the person has never tasted an apple. So there's only as much that you can tell the person about how an apple would taste. You can tell the person that the apple tastes slightly sweet, slightly sour, it's crunchy, it's not soggy, fresh apples are not soggy, it has this aroma, etc., etc. You can build a description of the object to a certain degree. But then there is that element of the experience which anyone has when they bite into an apple. That experience is very subjective. That experience is highly subjective. It is, for example, like the sound of metal rubbing on metal. Imagine metal rubbing on metal. To some people, that's a very unpleasant sound. To some people, that doesn't bother at all. I personally can't take the sound of metal running on metal. So a steel katori with a steel chammach, my sort of the hairs on my back rise. I just can't take that sound. But the point here is that the sound is objective. The sound has got only a certain quality. The quality of that sound of metal rubbing on metal is stable. The difference occurs in the way that sound is experienced by different people. And that's the idea of qualia, that people have a very unique experience of different things. So that qualia is very subjective. And that is where qualitative research sort of aims to get to. Another fascinating paper on this is, of all the paper titles one could have thought, I think this is one of my top 5 paper titles. The paper is called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? It's Thomas Nagel's classic paper, published in the 70s, I think 74. And in this paper, again, I would not get into the details of what the paper talks about. The basic idea is that we all know how bats move around. They use echolocation. We know the idea. But what actually it is like to echolocate can never be known by us because we just do not have that about us to experience that. Does that make sense? So that is the point which I would like to begin and kick off with, that qualitative research should be headed towards that element of subjective experiences, but with the recognition that these experiences are going to be subjective, and as researchers, we are never in principle going to have a direct access to it, because whatever we get from people are our interpretations of their experiences. We do not have a direct access to those experiences. So the attainment of quail in any form of qualitative inquiry is, again, different people have different views on it. In my view, I personally believe that it is unattainable. So qualitative research should begin with this, in my recommendation and my belief, qualitative research should begin with this sort of broad understanding. Right, so with that background about subjectivity and quail and qualia, we now move on to the issue of methods, because as you saw in the diagram that I shared of Valsina's paper, there's the phenomena, and then in order to sort of approach the phenomena, we need to have methods. And methods are, in many ways, the heart of all qualitative enterprise. We need to have the right methods that match the phenomena. So, in terms of methodology, and again, I'll sort of give a quick example to frame some of the issues that Surbhi is going to talk about next. Much of what we do in qualitative research or in any research is based around expectations and norms. People play roles. That's what it is. You all know what your role is in this enterprise. I know what my role is. My role is to faff and to sound intelligent. Your role is to seem interested. And we are all playing our roles very well. I mean, most of you are not interested. I'm not interested, but we are all playing our roles, isn't it? So much of what we do in qualitative research is about people following certain norms. So if there's an interview, we know that we would be sat in a comfortable chair. Someone would ask us some questions and we would give them answers. In doing so, we use language, and language again follows a set of rules, a set of assumptions that everyone thinks they understand. And a fascinating example comes from Garfinkel's ethnomethodology, and he argues that in any instance, whatever methods that we are using in qualitative research, all of it follows a social order that exists, and people in research, while doing research, they are constantly creating order. And here's a sort of great extract from his work. So the bits in blue is the researcher's conversation with S, who is the participant, if you will. So the participant asks the researcher, "Hi, Ray, how is your girlfriend feeling?" Then the experimenter or the researcher says, and this is a conversation that takes place between them. So the researcher says, "What do you mean, how is she feeling? Do you mean physical or mental?" The subject goes, "I mean, how is she feeling? What's the matter with you? He looks peeved." The researcher goes, "Nothing, just explain a little clearer. What do you mean?" Now, what is happening here is that expectations are getting breached. So this conversation, if you start with the first line, when the person asks, "Hi, Ray, how is your girlfriend feeling?" the person expects the responder to understand where this is headed. But if the responder challenges it, breaches the expectation, the conversation collapses. And this is a beautiful example of this. So if you carry on with this, skip it, how are your med school applications coming? What do you mean, how are they? You know what I mean. I really don't. There you go. It collapses. So it is almost a microcosm of what happens in research. People that you interview, people that you sort of have as your participants, they all have a sense of understanding why they're there. So if you're interviewing people who have had depression, your participant information sheet will tell them that we are interested in understanding depression. So they know that they're being interviewed as people who have experienced depression. Similarly, for something else, you have a profile that people fit, and that's what makes them your participants. And then the research follows on that. But in those in that enterprise, it is that sort of expectation of social order and norms that plays its role in shaping the conversation. And again, it is important to understand that. And in many instances, having some of these methodological sort of breaching instances are excellent to clarify and sort of hit on some point of novelty. If you breach this expectation and you challenge people on something fundamental, it is a good way to in a sense disrupt and dislodge the formulated and formulaic responses that people give in research. Now, moving on to sort of the main bit now, with the context being set, we'll talk about sort of three things. Surbi will pick up with the issue of biases and ethnocentrism in a paper that we have just finished, and it's going to come out soon. And she would also talk about the use of categories. Over to you.
Thank you, Apurv. So in my introduction, what I forgot to mention is that in real life, both Apurv and I are also married to one another. So where his role is to complicate life, complicate things, and my role is to simplify things and simplify life. So that's exactly where I see my pitch in this presentation, because I'm going to start talking about all the concepts that Apurv raised. I would try to situate it within a context of an example to take you through about the relevant points which we feel are very important to start thinking about. So I'm assuming the example that I'm picking up is that of conducting focus group discussions, FGDs. And I'm assuming that all of us here have had some experience of either conducting FGDs or having read about what focus group discussions are. Now, moving to a focus group discussion. Now, let me give you a background of focus group discussions. Now, focus group discussion is a method. I'm talking about one actual method that we use in qualitative research. It actually emerged in Western societies, and every method in qualitative research, whether it is FGD, interview, or it is ethnography, all the methods that we're going to talk about, they are always informed by a certain set of assumptions. Now, what are the assumptions which are there whenever we use the method of focus group discussions? For those of you who might not be aware of focus group discussion, let me briefly tell you about what that method entails. So a focus group discussion is where a researcher chooses a particular topic or phenomena, the earlier slide that Apurv showed, that he or she wishes to study, and to be able to gain more insights and perspectives on that particular phenomena of interest, we have 13 to 14, or a group of participants. The number can vary from 8 to 15. And then within this particular group is where you broach this particular topic that is of interest to you as a researcher, and where a group comes together, speaks, and talks about this topic in public. And it is, as you can see on your slide, it involves human participants. Everybody is encouraged to talk openly about a particular topic, and the discussion, that's where the term focus comes from. The discussion is always around a particular topic of interest, which is why it is not a random conversation, it is conversation with a purpose. It is a discussion with a purpose. And through that discussion, and this discussion is overseen by a moderator or researcher, the position that we would want to take when we conduct a research using focus group methods. And then we collect data in terms of verbal, non-verbal input. So as a researcher, we're interested in noting down the points that were raised, and also we are interested in noting down the non-verbal data, such as we make observations about their body language, gestures, the tone of speaking, so on and so forth. And this particular conduction or focus group discussion is a temporally finite event. That means that it has a finite starting point and it has a finite end point in terms of the time duration. So you always say that the discussion is going to last for about 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour, depending on what you as a researcher create in terms of the boundary of that focus group discussion. So this is the background. This is what a typical focus group looks like. Now, as I said, focus group discussion originated in what is known as, I'm using the word acronym, weird societies. Now, this method emerged in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic society. So that's where the acronym WEIRD comes from. And in that particular culture, in that particular society where this method originated, that society was built on certain foundations. For instance, one of the principles was that all the, and mind you me, that all these societies that we are talking about, Western societies, as we know, Hofstede talks about, these are individualistic societies. Now, individualistic societies work with certain set of assumptions and certain grounding rules. And in those societies, the concept of privacy is very, very important, which is why a focus group discussion is always held within a closed door. It is always so that, because those are societies which inherently cherish the privacy of the participants, and that's the reason whenever, even, you know, all the handbooks of focus group discussion talks about, in terms of giving guidance to the researchers, of always using a particular space where participants are not interrupted. And even when participants are talking, it is assumed that a particular participant is only talking for herself, himself, or themselves. So because these are the societies which cherish the individuality of the individual, and that's the reason why they perpetuate all these different set of assumptions that privacy should be cherished, participants are definitely speaking for themselves. And in our research, for instance, when we would want to adapt this method, use this method of focus group discussion in a collectivist society such as India, for instance, and that's where our argument comes from, because when we did research, we found how these very assumptions were defied by the social milieu fabric of the society. Before I come to that, so that is where there is a need for us to, at times, also not receive the method as give in, and perhaps also challenge what is termed as ethnocentrism, which is very much inherent in methodological positions. Because do not forget, these methods originated in weird worlds. And these weird worlds at times may not resemble the psychological, physical, socio-political realities of where we come from, that is the collectivist world. So having that sensitivity when we are choosing a method and also trying to adapt the method to the context then becomes very, very, very important. So another feature on this slide, we see the term interview societies. Now, in Western societies are known as interview societies because the very act of talking to one another, sharing all these factors are built into the very fabric of the society, which is not the case, which might not be the case. People might not be comfortable. We can, as a researcher, we cannot assume that people would be very comfortable, confident about speaking about certain topics in public. And it is informed, as Apoorv previously mentioned, it is influenced by the social norms, the cultural fabric, and all these things. So now the challenge for us as researcher, as much as we would want to use certain qualitative methods, is also be sensitive to how we need to adapt the method to, one, our research questions, second, also to the very context within which we are using those methods. So now in this paper, what we actually found when we started conducting a focus group discussion in one of the villages in rural India. And there, and I'm using the word Chopal, and I'm assuming that all of us would understand Chopal. So that is where the very concept of having private discussions in a village was not possible, because then it would make others think that, oh, what is happening? I think we are not trusted. And that sense of community, which is very cardinal to rural community, you breach that. And people would not want to be very comfortable in wanting to be seen in that side of the category where they are seen as breaching the trust in the community. So which is why the idea of having open discussions, and that's what we observed, that people wanted to have discussions in open, not in closed doors. And that is when we had to adapt the method and we decided to actually run the focus group in an open forum. And as I said, one of the assumptions and one of the requirements of the FGD method also is that it should not be disturbed by the onlookers. People should not be seen moving around. They should not interrupt when you are trying to discuss the topic, right? And when we conducted our research, we found that what happened on ground actually defied all these assumptions of FGD methods. So where onlookers, people who are not participants, who were just passing by, they wanted to pitch in and wanted to contribute to the topic.
Often what would happen is, I remember the focus group discussions that I did in Bihar, and I'm from Bihar, born and raised there. So, and it's a different, rural Bihar is a very different place. So people, so we'd hold, so just to add on first to what Surbhi was saying earlier, the distinction between privacy and secrecy is very thin, and it's a very thin line between privacy and secrecy in rural India, especially when you're an outsider. So if you're an outsider and you gather 5 locals from the village in a room and you start talking about poverty there, that would be thought as secret, not private. So no one in the village thought of that as private. People would think of that as secret. So doing focus groups there, no one ever agreed to be interviewed in the sort of village school or whatever. Everyone said, no, let's have it under the tree so that everyone can see us, that we are not plotting and we are not doing anything else. So that distinction between privacy and secrecy is a very thin line in collectivist societies, and that line is much thicker in the West. And also to add to what Surbhi said earlier, because it's a society which is well versed in the art of interviewing, and interviews are not naturalistic conversations. They are artificial paradigms for conversation. It's not a naturalistic paradigm for conversation. Interview means that, well, we both know we are here for this conversation on this topic. So it's an artificial paradigm. And that sense of what an interview is, it didn't exist in rural Bihar. So, someone would be passing by in the village, and one of the participants would shout, oh, which translates to, oh, where are you going? Come, sit down. So they would actually invite people to sit and listen. And that is the issue which is on the title of this slide. It's the question of matching your method to the phenomena. The phenomena there is that people are not well versed in the art of an interview society. They just don't understand the rules that work. So in many ways, that is Garfinkel's methodological breaching in reverse. So they breach our expectations of how the method should go. And then we think, nope, that's not how a focus group runs. And we are arguing, as Surbhi was saying, that the onus is on us to adapt the method to the phenomena.
And just to, there is a caveat there. So we are not suggesting there definitely would be certain sensitive topic which will always be within the realm of privacy. So at no point in time we are suggesting for those sensitive topics you can probably have a discussion in open. We're just trying to bring forth certain nuances of how at times methods need to be reconfigured. And so I was talking about the same method and to the discussion of onlookers. So we would see when we conducted this particular focus group discussions that people would pitch in, would continue to add to what other villagers are saying. And that in itself became a very thriving topic of debate, which gave us more insights as compared to if we had restricted ourselves to only 10 or 15 participants, which we originally began with. So at times you have to be more conscious about what exactly you are interested in. So that particular debate where people were actually challenging one another, when they were questioning the articulation of certain ideas, so on and so forth, I think that brought forward more enriched data, which is of our concern, as compared to if we would have completely restricted ourselves to what are the rules and the guidelines suggested by how to conduct FGDs. And so as a researcher, you have to at times adapt. And then the question of whether it is correct or incorrect to adapt the method lies in your authentic expression of what were the challenges that you faced and why you then required to adapt a particular method. So this is the background of, this is just an example of how we at times, all these qualitative methods, we used an example of FGD, how we have to also rehearse to adapt method to the phenomena of interest and also to the context where you would use that particular method, right? So now moving forward, and this I think is the most interesting bit of the presentation, this talk that I am going to speak about. And this is one topic that I would want you to critically engage with, the topic of categories. Now, as researchers, we invoke and use certain categories very, very frequently. The categories that I'm referring to here are categories of, for instance, when you impose certain categories such as unemployment, terrorist, criminal, all these academics, students, teachers, all these are categories, and we all at any given point in time as researchers are forever working with those categories. Because categories, what they do is they help us to try to simplify the social world that we live in. It also helps us to distinguish between different groups of people. So for instance, on this slide, you see a different color box. So red box is of that of plastic, blue box is that of paper, and I can't see this one, video hands, right? So the yellow box is that of a can. So what as researchers we've done is that we have tried to put people in these boxes. And that's how we start doing our research. So we choose our participant or group of participants that is of interest to us. For instance, we want unemployed people, we want urban, rural, poor, teachers, professional staff. All these are categories. And as I said, that the very process of thinking, the very act of thinking is a process by which we impose these categorization on the world so that it helps us to navigate, understand the world better. And this is a very normal process of thinking. Now, if this normal process of thinking goes unchallenged, and I'm trying to problematize the very use of social categories and how it blinds us to seeing something and not seeing other things. So what I'm proposing, the basic argument that I'm proposing here is that we need to challenge our use of social categories. I'm not saying that we can get rid of it. I am not saying that it is not right to use those categories, but I am trying to, what I'm arguing is a very strong theoretical position which speaks about how do we problematize the very use of social categories when we are doing qualitative research. And it is also important because the data that we collect from our participants, they are also talking to us in terms of those categories. So it is important for us to understand where these categories emerge in the minds of the researcher and where these categories emerge in the minds of the participants, right? So one way of problematizing this interrogation of categories is to think of 4 different problems that are evoked whenever we use a particular social categories. Now, perspectival, historical, disruptive by movement, constitutive of the phenomena. And let me just, I'm mindful of the time, I would speak about all these problems for about 2 minutes and not more than 2 minutes, I promise. So all categories are perspectival. Now, what does it mean? It simply means that it depends, whenever we are using a particular category, it depends on the perspective of the person who's using it. And also when we are trying to interpret those categories, it also depends on the perspective of us as researchers, as the way we understand those categories. And as Apoorv was saying, that it is not possible to have complete access in the minds of your participant, which is why being more sensitive to, let me give you an example of how this perspectival, how categories are influenced by perspectives. Now, if I were to ask you a simple question, how do you categorize the two of us? Are we your fellow academics? Are we, are we part of your group, people who have studied in India? Or are we categorized as the other, people who are teaching in a different cultural context than yours? So which category would you want to place us in? Now, depending, and all these categories are very, very true, but it depends on the perspective when you are looking at us, which category have you placed us? And that is what we want. So this is the very logic of perspectives. So when you are talking about unemployment, when you are talking about all these different categories, it is important for us to think that where these categories are emerging, and James always spoke about what is known as a psychologist's fallacy. And he spoke about the fact that there is an idea in the mind of a psychologist, and there is an idea in the mind of the participant. And at any given point in time, when these categories are put in motion, these categories are mobilized, they exist in three different spheres. These social groups that you categorize, these boxes that you create in your social world, can exist in three different spheres. One is the sphere that is of a researcher, your sphere. Then there is a sphere that exists in the mind of participants, or the ones being researched. And third is a context, or is a research sphere of the onlookers, people who are not onlookers, outgroups, people who are not part of those categories. So all these categories exist in these three different spheres. And then
I remember sort of a good example. I think there's a comedian I really like. He does stand-up comedy, Dylan Moran. I really love him. He's the funniest dry deadpan sort of act. And he once, in one of his sketches, he said that, and this is really profound. He said that ancient Greeks never called themselves ancient Greeks. Just think about it. We call them ancient Greeks. They never called themselves ancient Greeks. They probably just called themselves Greeks. So it's about perspective. We think of them as ancient Greeks, but they didn't think of themselves as ancient Greeks. They were contemporary Greeks for all that matters.
Yes, and I'm also reminded of another example that I was sharing with Apurv. So there was a research that was done on tourist on Ladakhi culture. And when
Alex
Gillespie's work, and when he actually, as a tourist, when we spoke about how tourists looked at Ladakhi culture, and they describe Ladakhi culture as because their interaction, and when I said Ladakhi culture, we were talking about people who are in hospitality industry, because people, the tourists would interact more with the hotel staff, so on and so forth. And tourist description of Ladakhi culture was, it is a very traditionalist society. They are very, very conventional and all of it. And when Gillespie, actually Alex Gillespie, asked the very people who were not working, people who were in Ladakh but were not working in the hospitality industry, whether people who work in the how did they look at people in the hospitality industry? And they said, oh, they are very, very, they are not part of Ladakhi culture. They are very modern because they are English speaking. They use a lot of terms which we are not aware. They eat a lot of food. But so the same set of people looked at from two different vantage points. So it is then just a matter of perspective that one takes when explaining these categories. So what does, as researcher, it tells us? So whenever, as social scientists, as qualitative researchers, we need to ask who is using that category and what are they using that category for So for you, for your participants and others who look at that category. So I've already taken. So the second point, all categories are historical. So this simply means that, for instance, let me give you an example. How do we categorize Indian culture after Modi was elected? Do you think there is some difference? Perhaps, yes. So I'm not getting into any trouble here. I'm not getting into any debates here, but how history, certain very pertinent points, turning points in the society, in the history, has also changed the very category. How do I understand American culture now after having seen Trump giving all these interviews on TV? So do you think your perspective of American culture, do you think, someone else's perspective of Indian culture has changed because of all these turning points which happened in this socio-political, historical milieu of a particular space? So that's the very point, that these categories...
The meaning of what is contained in that category, that changes with time. So, I mean, a good example would be the meaning of what it was to be a 30-year-old unmarried person in India. The meaning of what that was 50 years ago and what it is now has changed. I mean, 50 years ago, my parents' time, if you were unmarried at the age of 30, you were doomed. And today, if you're married at the age of 30, people say you're married too early. So the meaning of what is contained within that category, it is linked to the socio-cultural and historical moment in time, and what meanings we assign to a category also need to be situated in that broader framework.
And also being aware that how that particular category has evolved over a period of time, that will give us a more holistic understanding. And all categories, the third point, all categories are disrupted by movement. What I simply mean here is that when you are interviewing somebody, when you are talking to any person, it is not only one category. We all know that we are playing multiple roles. We have multiple identities, and we are at different life stages, etc. So at any given point in time, I'm a wife, I'm an academic, I'm also somebody who's an Indian, I'm also an immigrant, somebody who's moved to the UK for work, and so on and so forth. I'm a woman. So there is not only one single category. When people are responding to you, people continue to move in and move out of all these different social categories. And as a researcher, you have to be then sensitive towards what category was evoked when a certain response was given to you. So that's the very reason of being more careful of how people continue to move in and move out of these different social categories, because it is not single, it's not the singular self. It is always the multiple selves that we all have. So these are multiple identities, and we keep on shifting our identity positions at various points in time. And then being sensitive to whether I'm responding to you as an immigrant, or I'm responding to you as Indian, somebody who identifies with you. So all these perspectives have to be taken into account where people continue to, move across different categories. And the last point, and I promise I will stop here, all categories, all social categories that we use as scientists, as social scientists, we are also blamed of reinforcing the phenomena, reinforcing those categories. So for instance, at times, all these categories also, because we are using those categories without having reflected on what these categories are doing in the minds of the participants, what these categories are doing to our own minds as researchers, what we are doing is that we also re-establish the same very category, because we have not challenged those categories. So what are the main arguments that I am trying to suggest here? Let me just summarize in 2 sentences. And what I'm trying to say here is that when we are starting any research, especially qualitative research project, it would be a gross error to not challenge and not challenge these categories and think that how people are moving in and out of those categories, what are the different perspectives? Because if we do so, then we would be making the same error as a lay person would. So a more reflective approach to looking at those categories is what we should be aiming at. Back to you, Pur. Sorry if I took a lot of time.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. With that problematic in place, and by the way, I think I forgot to put the reference for this here. Much of this comes from Gillespie, Cornish, and Howarth's paper. I think it's 2010, wasn't it? 10ish, yeah.
10.
Yeah. So if you wanted a reference for this, that's Gillespie, Cornish, and Howarth, 2010. So much of that problem with categories being established, we quickly turn to another very practical aspect of researching, that we use proxies in our research. And by proxy, I mean exactly what it sounds like. We do not have access to some of, or to a lot of things. So what we do is we take something which stands as an indicator. A good example of this would be the poverty line. So much research in psychology, especially in India, people, when they're researching poverty, they ask people if they are below or above poverty line. Now, poverty is the idea that is being researched. We are researching poverty, and to research poverty, we need to access people who can be sort of assigned to the category poor. So what we need is two categories, poor and not poor. And in order to find who the poor are, we need a definition, a framework to say that, yes, on this definition, on this framework, person X is poor. For that, we use a proxy. The proxy in India, which is very often used, is that of poverty line. So if you're below poverty line, you're taken as poor. So that is what a proxy is. And in many works, especially after the Lal card came in India, that was seen as a proxy for being poor if you had a Lal card. So proxies are unavoidable. We cannot do research without using some form of proxy. I'll not get into too much detail about the complexities in using proxies, but the essence that I'm trying to say is we would be using proxies. All that discussion about categories is what we intend to suggest as something that informs the proxies that we use. So before we use proxies to assign people in categories, being mindful of all of that is what our sort of take-home point here is. Something that Surbi alluded to already is that research is shaped by the times that we live in. In fact, the whole discussion about categories alluded to that. And there's I just wanted to make a quick reference to something Francis Bacon said in the 16th century in Novum Organum, which translates to New Instruments of Science. He talks about what he calls idola mentis, idols of mind, and he sort of identified different idols of mind. What he argued there, and which is true to a large degree even today, and even in natural sciences, not just in physical sciences, but even in natural sciences, is that the way we do science, and I use this term science broadly to encompass both natural and social sciences, the way we do science is often determined by the way we have been doing science. So it is that structuring effect of how past knowledge was produced informs the way we currently produce knowledge. And much of that, in a sense, integrates and weaves together what Surbi spoke of earlier about focus group methods. So this whole idea that privacy is a requirement, people would want privacy when they're doing any interviews or focus group, is the way it was done when the method was evolving in the market research framework of America, and then when it was imported by sociologists in the 70s. We continued doing it like that because that was the way it was being done. So much of science is simply a case of doing it the way it was being done. And that's what Francis Bacon argued in the 16th century. We see a lot of that happening in social sciences. We blindly just follow the method that we have been prescribed. Someone wrote a paper in 1967 with a 5 bullet point idea that how this method should be used, and we still continue to use that. And what we miss there is what we have been talking to you about today, the matching of phenomena and the method. And it is high time we did that. But just to add, I mean, it's not just a problem of social sciences. Gerard Holton has a beautiful paper on the issue of themata in natural science, and he says how even in physics, the way we approach studies and research in physics is informed by what he calls themata. And that is a beautiful paper, Gerard Holton's paper on themata. So essentially, what we are talking here is to think in terms of fitting the method to the phenomena and challenging the ways in which we do qualitative research in the direction where we are seeking a greater fit between phenomena and the method. And the focus group example that should be discussed hits that nail on the head. Right, moving on, it's almost sort of a postscript to all of this, because in qualitative research, context is a word that we hear a lot. I mean, I'm guilty of using the word context a lot before I was slightly more clued up on what context was. I remember using the word context a lot in my
In fact, that's how we were taught. That one of the introductory, I still remember one of the introductory classes, everything was relegated to this very idea of context. It depends on the context. It depends on the context. And nobody actually repackaged or unpacked the very term. What do we mean by context? Go on, sorry.
Yeah, so no, it's just absolutely right. So context is something which we use a lot in qualitative research, and it almost has become the new culture. So, you know, in 80s when cultural psychology was gaining, late 80s and early 90s, when it was gaining ground, anything that people could not explain in their quant data, they would say, well, it's arguably due to the culture. So culture was that waste basket category of 80s, late 80s and 90s. Anything that you couldn't explain, you attributed it to culture. Similar thing
has happened with the context.
With context in qualitative research. Whatever findings come, and if they're surprised, we attribute it to context. But here's a bleeding problem. Context is indeterminate. It's infinite. What is the context of anything? Is it the person you're talking to? Is it the city in which you're talking to? Is it the country in which you're having the conversation? Is it the time of the day that is having it? So or
are you forgetting a very important thing? The mood of the participant, the mental
absolutely.
framework of the participant when he chose or she chose to speak to you. So it is all context. Everything is actually just relegated to that particular.
Absolutely. So, and that's the problem with context. It is indeterminate. It is a bottomless regress. It's an infinite regress. You could end up with having everything as a part of the context. So when we speak of context, therefore, the fine point or the thick point, it's not a fine point at all, the broad point that I'm making is that we must understand that context is indeterminate, or appreciate that it is indeterminate, but also try and think of it as something that gets framed. So context gets framed by different things. In a paper that should be out soon enough, we argue about the importance of context, and we speculate that three broad things, and again, I can't get into the details of all of this, but I'll very sort of briefly allude to them. That context on the one end, we can think of the context of a research interview or a focus group discussion or any qualitative method as relatively fixed. And that fixity, that stability comes from the research question that you bring. So if the research question, if the research is on, say, the experiences of, say, survivors of genocide,
genocide, earthquake,
what Ravi sir's research, for example. So if Ravi sir's research on trauma and healing yes, so the research question frames the context, and in that sense, it's relatively fixed. So if you're talking to someone about something traumatic, for example, surviving, that determines the context to a large degree, and in many ways, a research interview on healing and survival would be very different from a research interview on drinking. That would frame the context. So that is a more fixed element. So there's a strong influence of the research question. On the other end, there is extreme variability. Different survivors of the same earthquake would have had different experiences. So the variability in that comes from, the variability in the context comes from the different life histories of the participants. The variability comes from different agendas that researchers and participants bring to the table. And in between there, you have the intermediate, relatively stable, but also fluid influences on context. Things such as the role of culture, if you're talking to a person from a rural upbringing or an urban upbringing, if you're speaking to a person from a highly individualistic setup, versus person you're speaking from a native society, largely collectivist society, the way different languages are used. So all of that forms the intermediate, somewhere in between relative fixity and great variability is that intermediate zone. So what then, the point we're trying to make here is, instead of thinking of context a priori and before the research begins, we must think of context of any research exercise as dynamic and evolving. Every conversation during the course of an interview, the context evolves every time something is said, because what is said becomes part of the context of what is going to be said next. So context in any research, qualitative research exercise remains evolving and dynamic.
And that's why I think the very tenet of whatever knowledge is produced is a co-produced knowledge. So your question influence the research, the participant, and the participant answer influences you. So this dynamic interaction between these two agencies lead to what is known as co-production of knowledge, something that again gets defined by the very immediate context within which the research takes place. Yeah, go.
Okay, so this brings us towards the end. I'll not discuss this slide, but this is a paper that I think is really, it's a really sound paper to get to grips with all these issues that we have discussed, or most of the issues that we have discussed today. The paper by Quine on what there is. It takes an ontological and epistemological framework on how to gain knowledge and what knowledge is, and how to develop methods that fit the phenomena, etc., etc. All of those debates are in there. And on the left, you see 3 references, which I think are really interesting readings on it. The first one is the 1972 Tanner lecture by Karl Popper on 3 worlds. It's freely available on LSE repository. And then if you're sort of inclined in that direction, Gustav Bergman's essay on ontological assays. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Bergman's essay on ontological assay. Yeah, well, whatever that is. So that is also a very interesting read in terms of breaking stuff down and thinking of concepts, breaking down concepts in a sort of organized fashion and then devising your methods around it. So this is just a slide that we've put in there to sort of, if you're enthused by any of this and you wanted to read further, these are sort of good starting points, I suppose. Right, so to summarize, what we have said today, what happened?
I think you moved it further, yeah.
So what we have discussed today is in many ways pretty straightforward, but our view, fundamental, that qualitative research must sort of acknowledge and shape itself with qualia. So thinking in terms of subjective experiences of the individual, of the being. The second point that we talked about is that methods, like everything else, they are shaped by norms, and the idea that the set way of doing certain methods in a certain way influences how we do them currently. And the example that will be discussed, our focus groups, was to that effect. Again, we discussed about the use of categories and why we must be sensitive towards using categories, because as we said, people move between different categories. Someone who is unemployed on the day of your interview was employed before. Someone who is an immigrant in your research interview was not an immigrant before he left or she left their original country. So people move different, and that's what makes categories really sort of complex. And the way we sort of assign interpretations to those categories must be cautiously thought through.
And just to add one more point in that, I think as a researcher, it is also our responsibility to see that how these categories, all these social categories, are made meaningful to the participants. How do they develop it, and how do they, or all these categories, are also challenged and debated at the same point in time? So there are a lot of these tensions, these nuances when either your research participant is using a category or you as a researcher are trying to understand those categories. You need to further scratch those meanings and then see how these categories were evoked in the first place, whether in the minds of your participant and or in your mind. So yeah.
Yeah, that concludes. And final point was pretty straightforward, that instead of thinking of context as a priori and stable, we must think of context as something that evolves during the course of the interview itself, and that there are different contributors to context. There are relatively very fluid ones, and then there are relatively stable ones.
We need to give time for question answer. So it's,
yeah, I'm done.
Right. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is what we thought we could manage in the time that was given to us. I really hope that you were able to take at least 1 or 2 points.
I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Yeah.
I think it's still time if you want to continue with.
No, I think we would want to rather much prefer to take up questions, because I think we can talk for about 5 hours, because that's exactly what we keep doing here.
So let's take some questions, Surbi. Do you have it?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have it? Yeah.
All right. So firstly, I would really like to thank both of you for such an informative session, for telling us such new things about focus group discussions, the use of categories, the context that should not be considered as static, rather it is fluid, it's evolving, difference between privacy and secrecy. Thank you so very much. And now we'll be moving to questions. So first question is that the participant wants to know about the usage and coinage of the concept of weird ethnocentrism.
Go take that one.
Weird. So weird is an acronym which stands for W is westernized, industrialized, and
Rich.
No, I always English speaking.
No. Educated. He's
sorry,
educated.
Yes, westernized, industrialized, English speaking,
Educated.
rich, develop democratic societies. So this, in a sense, what we are saying is that a lot of methods, especially in the context of FGD, these methods were developed in these societies, and because these are
the coining of the term weird was in a 2010 paper by Hertzlich and Narayan.
Yeah, and since then, I think this has actually gained entry into the lexicon of research, where we have started becoming, rather than just simply saying this is Western culture or collectivist non-Western culture. So Western culture is further divided into it being Western, industrialized, rich, educated, democratic, so on and so forth. And what we are saying is that the methods, when in the first place, when they were developed in these societies, they were informed by the social norms by which those societies govern. And that is why the concept of privacy is very central to the idea of Western society. So all of it, and that's why we need to challenge those. So that's the meaning of Western weird ethnocentrism, and how we need to be a bit more careful when we are trying to use the methods which originated elsewhere, how true they are to the context or the cultural milieu that you are trying to investigate. So that bit of adaptation is where we are in fact arguing that we need to challenge certain assumptions of those methods, because essentially those methods were made by Westerners. So they were governed by a very different set of mental models as compared to us. Does that?
I'm really looking now. Thank you so very much. Moving on to the next question. Is it really possible to have a concrete research in exactitude?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Qualitative research.
Yeah.
So is that qualitative research or research general?
I guess, obviously, sir, it's in qualitative research.
I mean,
I still didn't get the question. What?
So is it possible to have a concrete research in exactitude? I mean, there's a short and a long answer. The short answer is, why would you want that? That's the reason why we do qualitative research, is because we don't want to come to universals, and we are not really looking for universals. We want to get to greater textures of what is happening. So in many ways, I would say we actually should be running away from anything to do with exacts. What we want is to understand that phenomena and people and their relationship to the phenomena, they vary a lot, and our effort should be towards capturing it. So that's the short answer, which I realize is not very short. The long answer is sort of that as we have been sort of talking in the course of this session, thinking of things in terms of stability is assuming that things are objective and they have fixity. Phenomena, especially in social sciences, and a lot more than in natural sciences, they are not fixed. They vary a lot. They vary. I mean, they vary depending on the time of the day, the mood the person is in, the phenomena that we try and investigate in qualitative research. It varies a lot. So, I mean, I would probably say that thinking of exacts is probably not the onus of qualitative research, and we should be moving away. It's a vestige of the old sort of
scientific
Newtonian idea. Newton. I mean, I blame Newton for much of it because Newton is really responsible for much of what has happened in science. So he came up with this whole thing, which was taken up by physicalists and just moved through generations. I mean, Descartes had his go at it. So yeah.
I think of course there is a related question. I think which you already answered, but I just want to confirm: can one be conclusive in qualitative research?
That should not be the aim to begin with.
Yeah.
Conclusive. I mean, we'll be playing with words here. We'll be playing with words. I mean, what do you mean by conclusive? I mean, all good research should be rigorous, and I would want research to be conclusive in the sense that the interpretations should be able to stand the test of rigor and quality. So if you mean conclusive in that sense, I think all qualitative research better be conclusive on that front. But if you mean conclusive in the sense that here's the finding, I have established it, like the sort of acceleration due to gravity is 9.8 meter per second square, we have got that, there's no changing on it. No, I don't think there would be. I mean, even quant research is not conclusive. I mean, psychology has a tremendous replication crisis. I mean, all the big research in psychology, there was a big volume published of how in psychology we have struggled to replicate all our classical findings. Findings that have been taken as sort of the hallmark findings of the discipline. We have struggled to replicate all of them, or most of them, I should say. Yeah.
I think
our discipline has a big problem with replication. Replication is a big problem even in experimental studies. Everything that we find, and we say that it was an experiment, so it was really solid. But people have tried to replicate it. They've come up with absolutely different results. Absolutely. Following the same procedures, the same stuff.
And we're talking about classical studies that have actually informed the discipline, that has actually laid foundation of our disciplines. And that's the reason we need to actually, the new way of thinking about this is that, do we want to make this as one of the aims of the research, that it should be replicable? And that's where a lot of debate is happening
in quant. In qual replicability is just nonsense.
So as Apoorv said, that I think as long as you are able to demonstrate in qualitative research, through your qualitative research, that how rigorous you have been at every given step of the research, as long as you're able to do that, and that's where the authenticity and reflexivity of you as a researcher and having the ability of expressing this holds more value as compared to what perhaps the meaning of exactness is in quantitative tradition of the research.
That's what all the sort of landmark volumes in qualitative research they suggest. I mean, Guber and Lincoln say the same. More recently, Bauer and Gaskell, they say Bauer and Gaskell's text is a lot more recent and it's a lot more updated with what has happened in the discipline. And they sort of think in terms of qualitative research in terms of indicators of quality. So that's, I think, what we should be aiming for instead of
and I just recently
replication.
saw a question on the chat box by Ajit Jha, and he speaks about how to avoid the bias in a researcher, despite he takes into consideration all sorts of context you talked about, right?
Believing that the researcher too has a particular socio-cultural background.
Yes, so that's exactly what I meant by that. We are not saying as a researcher, we are tabula rasa, blank slates. We always would have certain interpretations, certain meanings of all the categories of all, and the challenge lies and the authenticity lies in having to express this as part of when you are trying to analyze, interpret your result, and trying to explicitly state that this is the position, this is what my influences have been, and do not also think about, as a researcher, a lot of times your notions of what you thought about a particular category, a particular phenomena, also that notion also changes during the very duration of your research. And all of us, Shalini would vouch for it, so would Apoorv and I, and everyone else here who've actually done qualitative research, that how our understanding also evolves and how we also evolve as researcher, as long as you make a reflective account of expressing those things. Because you're not expected to be tabula rasa. We are not blank slates. We are socialized in a particular way, and our experiences do shape the way not only we choose a particular research topic, how we conduct our research, how we approach the participants, how we interpret the phenomena. The key point is in explicitly talking about it. I hope that helps.
There is one question in the question box, again, similar to this. How can a researcher avoid pitfalls in qualitative research?
Oh, that's a session for 5
Oh,
hours.
This research involves personal bias. Again, the word that is used. So if you can throw light on the first part, how can a researcher avoid pitfalls in qualitative research?
I mean, there are many pitfalls. One of the things that Surbi mentioned earlier, William James's idea that it's a psychologist's fallacy. We project our own ideas onto our participants. I think, I mean, as Surbi said, there can't be a quick answer to this, but an overall answer is that thinking in terms of so qualitative is in, so an oral answer is, let me rephrase, the overall answer I would have is in terms of thinking that qualitative research is an act of interpretation. You are interpreting like you do in any research. In quantitative research, our interpretation rests on significance value. So we check if something is statistically significant or not, and that relies on probability. So in quant, we rely on probability, and we, following Fisher, we just said that 0.5% probability is good enough to say that it is not by chance. I think of it in the same sense that, like in quant, we are saying that what we have found is not by chance. There is an effect here. I think of it, for better or for worse, in the same way in the qualitative papers that I write, and I think in terms of making claims, which I am confident about, that there is a phenomena that is underlying all of this, and there is sufficient evidence for me to make a certain claim. So I think of it in terms of interpretations, evidence, and the veracity of the claim based on the data.
Thank you, sir. There is one more question. What can replace culture and context?
I'm afraid, because we would have to.
I mean, we have 7 minutes. We have to promptly finish it at 11:30. I'm sorry.
Okay. No issues, sir. Okay, so
we can definitely take up one more question.
Only one question. So let me select. Let me see if it.
Sure.
We are very, very sorry. We've presented our email addresses. So if there are any very particular inquiries, we're happy to answer those if you write to us on our email. I'm afraid because of the time constraints, we'd have to leave another 5 minutes.
Let's take questions instead of having that.
If I think one question is on proxies, so just if you can elaborate on the proxies or give an example.
Can't see the question. What's the question, Shalini?
That's in question answer chats actually. I don't know. Q&A. You can see there are 3 questions in the Q&A.
Okay, so here's the question. Yeah, so when you're describing proxies, are you talking about how we can define the categories used for research?
To some degree, yes. That's a good question, actually. So yes, we would be using categories. Absolutely. We cannot conceive a research where a qualitative research where we don't end up assigning people into categories. I mean, otherwise, I mean, interpretation is attributing A to B. So you need to have A and B, right? And those are at least the very necessary categories that you would need to have a research enterprise. So of course, yes, we would have categories. And often we use those categories and we make them operational, for the lack of a better word, by using proxies. Gender is a good example. I mean, in India, a common practice is to use two genders. In Indian research, if you give a form to someone to fill in, you have male or female. Now, that is an example of how we are using genitals as the proxy. Whether you have masculine genitals or feminine genitals, that's the basic. I mean, if you strip everything away, that's the basic idea of having male and female as two categories based on external genitals. If you thought more sensitively about gender, you would have more categories. You would have male, female, intersex, so on and so forth. So thinking of what proxy you're using to operationalize a category is what I think is of importance. We need to think of what proxies we use and what the impact of using a certain proxy to define a certain category is. Again, an example could be of using lal card as a proxy of being poor. So people in the 90s who had lal card were classified as poor. But is that really the right form of classifying someone as poor or not? So it's about asking what a proxy is and what is the impact of selecting one proxy over the others. And can there be a better proxy to assign people into certain categories?
And I think a more sophisticated utilization of categories also draws from a very simple premise that all categories are human constructions. They were constructed. There are no natural categories. We ascribe people to certain categories. So because it is a human construction, that's the reason a more sophisticated approach would want to investigate what were the different perspectives, what were the historical positions, how people continue to move in and out. We are not saying that we can, at any given point in time, get rid of those categories, because that's the way we think. But the same point in time, another perspective says that they didn't exist in vacuum. They exist in social world. We created those categories to transact in this social world. But at any given point in time, they are not static. People continue to move amongst various categories. And having that sensitivity and opening your mind to be wanting to look at those, something which, as long as I know, for a very long time has gone unchallenged. We just take it for granted. What we are asking you to do is not to get rid of those categories, just become more sensitive towards those.
Actually, there are many questions, but I would again, seeing the time constraint and the resource persons, they have their other.
Sorry, it just happens to be one of those days when we have to immediately be at some other place in another 15 minutes. Sorry.
So, we will, if you can answer all those questions in the discussion forum, we've already sent you the registration process, and there you can see all the questions of the participants. Okay, that would be.
I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, I probably wouldn't have the time to go through the discussion forum. It probably would be much easier to hold another sort of conversational session than to type in all the responses. I'll be honest. I mean, I don't think I would have the time for that. It would probably be much easier to have another 30 minutes.
Yes.
Next Saturday or some point next week, and we take all the questions.
Sure.
So just give us the list of questions, and be happy to come again and speak to everyone for another half an hour.
That's so nice. That's so nice. So let me then close close this session. So it's such an interesting session. I don't know where should I start and where should I end, but I would just say that you have raised really pertinent issues, really essential and foundational issues which we rarely think about before taking a qualitative research. So we're always thinking of the method part and the other thing, but these are something, the category thing, and particularly challenging the categories. I think I really thought about it. I never thought that at least this could be done. We always teach our students about challenging the theories, but never the methods particularly, because I always thought methods are given to us. So even thinking of deconstructing that, I mean, it's really, really amazing, and very important thing for me to know. And I thank you, from the bottom of my heart, from all the participant sides also, my team, and myself, because it has been really, really important session for us.
It's always been a pleasure, Shalini, always a pleasure. And I think even when we were thinking about this discussion, because we knew that we're not talking to undergraduate students, postgraduate students, we are talking to our own colleagues who have some very fundamental understanding. So that's why it was a very conscious decision for us to probably raise more problems than to give answers, and talk about the tried and tested things of this is the method, do this, doesn't it? I don't think. So thank you very much for giving us the opportunity. It has been a pleasure. Thank you to all the participants who joined our live session. And as promised, at some point in time, we do look forward to coming back and have a half an hour of.
Yes. We'll see.
So thanks, Shalini, for giving us the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So
thank you, Shalini. Thank you, everyone,
thanks,
for your time.
Thanks, the organizing team.
It has been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for the